Hi viewers, in this video I will show you how I removed the support bearing from my intermediate CV axle shaft and how I reinstalled it on a spare shaft.
A year ago I replaced the boots on this CV axle assembly, but due to months of roadworks near my house, the CV joints got damaged. Bad CV joints can cause vibrations while accelerating. It can also produce clicking or knocking noise when the wheels are in motion and turning left or right. A growling noise with a pitch variation related with the RPM of the intermediate axle shaft can be a sign that the support bearing is worn out. For most people, it would be better to replace the old assembly with a brand new CV axle shaft assembly. Personally, I decided to save the axle shaft support bearing from the actual assembly to install it on a used assembly I paid less than 40 Canadian dollars. To begin, I disassembled the parts to clean the housing and look for what could cause the vibrations. Here, you can see the grooves made by the tripod rollers on the inner walls of the housing. Because the intermediate shaft was not useful anymore, there was no problem cutting it to save the bearing. First, I used an angle grinder with a large cutoff wheel to cut the shaft very close to the bearing on the housing side. For the second cut on the other side of the bearing, I kept enough spacing to be able to press the bearing out. To avoid damaging the bearing and keep it in good condition, I used the middle cup to precisely apply pressure on the inner race and remove it safely. To be able to use the intermediate replacement shaft, there was no need to save the other bearing, so I just had to cut it out. The first step was to cut out the outer race and remove the bearing balls. After, when the outer race was removed, it was easy to cut the inner race. I used a small metal chisel to crack it and slide it out. The small cutting mark on the bearing mating surface of the shaft was also repolished. Next, I applied a small coat of grease to ease the fitting of the replacement bearing. Then, to make sure to evenly position the bearing over the mating surface, I used a proper size steel pipe to fit on the edge of the inner race and evenly press down the bearing in place. I also added a steel flange to optimize the impact of the rotor when I was striking. I didn't like the external condition of the shaft, so I cleaned it and I painted it with rust paint. The next morning, the intermediate axle shaft was ready to be reassembled. I wiped out the remaining grease and the tripod rollers were ready to be greased again. Usually, I use molybdenum grease to grease the CV joints, but for this project, I used polyurea grease to match what had been previously used to lubricate these CV joints. I also applied a coat of grease inside the housing. After that, the boot was ready to be fastened on the housing. Once the CV boot was properly positioned in the groove, I secured it with a clamp. Next, the clamps were crimped. Then, the CV axle assembly was almost ready. To add more protection against water, salt and rust, I applied some grease around the bearing. Since my VOLVO is equipped with an automatic transmission, it's okay to lubricate the splines of the inner shaft to connect it with the differential. The splines at the end of the outer shaft do not require any lubricant, but they must be free of rust and clean. For more information about CV axle removal and installation, you can watch my YouTube video about the CV boots replacement.
Usually, when a CV joint or a bearing is failing, it increases the risk of getting into a car crash, so it is important to find the problem and fix it as soon as possible.